Good morning. You know, I've had a few people comment to me over the past several months, I don't know how you guys come up with your sermon topics. And now I can't speak for the other men, but have you ever heard of the YouTube black hole? Sounds like some of you have been on that trip. For those of you that haven't, it goes something like this. You look up, you start by searching how to do something. Maybe it's fix a lawnmower, fix your car, fix something around the house, because you can find anything on YouTube. And if you've ever been on YouTube, you'll notice there's a little scroll bar on the right side of the screen that has suggested videos. And typically this is based on your previous viewing history. And so you finish the video that you were watching and you look over at that bar and you notice, well, that video looks interesting. So you click on it. Did you finish that one? Well, that video looks interesting. So you click on that one, and this just spirals out of control. And you can spend 2-3 hours clicking through videos. And before you know it, you've gone from a car repair video to watching dancing penguins. And you wonder, how in the world did I get here? Well, that's kind of how it is for me when trying to settle on a sermon topic. I usually, start thinking about it is when I know what my next date is to preach. And I'll have an idea and I'll write that down in the notes app of my phone and maybe throw a few scriptures to go with it. And then I hear someone say something, maybe during a conversation or on the radio, and I think, that'd make a pretty good sermon. So I pull out my phone and I write that down in there. And then I hear something else, so I write that down. And then this goes on. And before you know it, I've got 6 or 7 sermon topics in my phone. And eventually I just have to stop writing them down and pick one. Now what this means is you better be careful when you're talking with me. Because if you see me pull out my phone mid-conversation, you might just be the next sermon topic. Now, when I was around 6 or 7 years old, I saw my first magic show. And now this wasn't a big Vegas production, where they make tigers disappear. This was just a little traveling magician who came to town. And it was at that show that I fell in love with magic. Or I should say, fell in love with illusions. And my brother and I both, after that, we would go to the bookstore and we would buy magic books with our money. And we would go home and we would look through and find the ones that we could do, which were mostly card tricks. And we would practice them repeatedly in front of each other, in front of the mirror. And then we would go bug our parents for the next hour. But I was so impressed by what I saw that I wanted to, or rather had to know how it was done so that I could do it and show other people and confuse them just as much as I was confused. And I still like to find new card tricks. Ask some of the youth group. We go on winter retreat, and that's one of the things that I like to do is perform card tricks to them. But they are just that, tricks. Each one has been designed and engineered to provide the illusion that the magician has the ability to make things disappear, change color, get torn apart and put back together, etc., etc. When in fact it requires no special abilities whatsoever. Yet people are still so mesmerized by these illusions that theaters around the world are filled with crowds every night to witness these performances. So I have a simple question for you this morning. It's kind of the basis of the lesson. Are you mesmerized by the miracles that Jesus performed? And I ask that because if we're not careful, the Bible can lose its authority and just become another book of stories. But these are not just stories. They're real life, historical facts. When it comes to the miracles that Jesus performed, there was no trickery. There was no false bottoms, no secret pockets. The miracles of Jesus were the power of God shown to man. And crowds of people followed Jesus as the word spread of the things he was doing. Now, throughout the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we read of the many miracles Jesus did while on earth. And this morning, though, I would like to stick to the book of John. And I want to just kind of touch the surface of the miracles that we read about in this book. As I've said before, I'm not here to teach you anything you didn't already know. I'm just here to remind you of a few things. It doesn't take long. In John chapter 2, we see the first miracle that Jesus performs. While at a wedding feast, the wine runs out, and Mary tells Jesus about the dilemma. Now remember, Jesus has not performed any miracles up to this point. But if there was anyone who knew without a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was God and that he could do something about this situation, it was his mother. And starting in verse 6, we read that there were 6 water pots of stone, each containing between 20 or 30 gallons apiece. And Jesus tells the servants to fill up the 6 water pots with water. And when they fill them up, he tells them to draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. And we know how the story goes. The water is turned into wine, but not just any wine. The master of the feast calls it the good wine. Now, I'm no expert on wine production, but as I understand it, the way the juice was preserved in ancient times was by boiling it until it became a thick syrup. This substance was then stored in new skin bottles and referred to as new wine. Putting new wine into old wineskins could introduce fermentation. So when needed, the syrup would be squeezed out of the skin bottles and would be reconstituted as a drink by adding water. So it took quite a bit of time and work to make this. Well, Jesus had neither time nor did he do any work. He didn't even touch the water pots. He merely said, "Draw some out and serve it." Now, upon seeing this, in verse 11, we read that his disciples believed in him. And not that they didn't already believe, but you've got to imagine at this point there might be a little bit of doubt or uncertainty. But after they saw this, they realized this is the real deal, right? It wiped out all doubt that they had. So Jesus left Galilee, but came back later in chapter 4, starting in verse 46. There was a nobleman whose son was sick to the point of death. And he found Jesus and began asking him to come down to heal his son. Now, people must have been asking a lot of favors out of Jesus, because his comment, he seemed to, I could sense a little frustration in his comment to the nobleman. He said, "You people just won't believe unless you see signs and wonders." Now, I want you to hold on to this comment, because we're going to come back to a similar comment to this towards the end. And I'll let you know when we get there. But the man inquired again, "Please, just come before my child dies." And as a parent, we can understand the man's anxiety. And Jesus looks him in the eyes and says, "Go, your child is alive." And upon hearing this, the man believed the word of Jesus and went home. He didn't ask questions. He just went home. And before he made it to the house, he was met by his slaves, and they told him his son was alive. And he asked them, "When did he get well?" And they told him, "Yesterday. At the 7th hour, the fever left him." And the father knew it was at that exact hour that Jesus told him, your son is alive. And he himself believed, as did his entire household. Just amazing. Sometime later, Jesus was in Jerusalem. We're in chapter 5 now. And there was a pool known as Bethesda, which had 5 porches. And your version may use another word other than porches. And we read in verse 3 that in these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of water. Now the next verse, verse 4, is not included in every manuscript or every translation, but it's included in the New King James Version, and that's what I'm reading from. And I think it helps to clarify what the moving of water is. It says, "For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had." So there was a man by this pool who had been lame for 38 years, couldn't walk, laid out on a pallet. And Jesus asked him if he wants to get better, to which the man replies, "How can I? I need help to get down to the pool, and by the time I get the help that I need to get down there, somebody's beaten me to it. Somebody's dipped their foot in first." Then Jesus says, "Take up your pallet and walk." And immediately the man was well. He picked up his pallet and began to walk. Now, can you imagine every day sitting beside this pool with the one goal of getting into the water first and not being able to make it? Then a stranger, at least at the time, the man did not know who Jesus was. He was a stranger. Comes along and tells you to get up and walk, and for the first time in 38 years, you wiggle your toes, you bend your knees, you stand up, and you start walking. And this must have grabbed the attention of the local people who had to have seen this man every day. Now up and walking about. But this is also the point at which the Jews' impression of Jesus started to really change. Because there was one problem with this. It happened on the Sabbath. All this time they've been hearing about this man and the signs he was giving. And now he's doing work on the Sabbath? So the Jews went to Jesus and persecuted him for working. But Jesus told them, "My Father has been working until now, and I myself am working," which just enraged them. And now the Jews sought to kill him even more. Because now he is not only working on the Sabbath, but he's also calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. Now you can imagine the excitement that Jesus has stirred up at this point. And he has garnered quite the following. In John chapter 6, we read that Jesus went up onto a mountainside with his disciples and sat down. And when he looked up, he saw a great crowd coming towards him. And Jesus leaned over to Philip and he said, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And verse 6 says, he asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. And Philip answered him with what I like to think is what Jesus was hoping that he'd answer him with. He says, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Just a bite." And then another of his disciples, Andrew, spoke up and he said, "Here's a boy with 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" And I can just see Jesus with a little smirk on his face. And he says, "Tell the men to sit down." And they sat down, about 5,000 men. Now to put this into perspective, I looked at our attendance over the last month. And we averaged somewhere between 300 and 400 people in the worship assembly. Now, I know we can do better than that, but that's what we've been averaging. And we would have to multiply our average attendance by about 12 to equal the 5,000 people. You know, we have some wonderful cooks that provide meals for us every Wednesday night. And I'd like to see how far 5 loaves and 2 fishes would go. You would have to get pretty creative to feed just 10 people with this. I'm afraid there'd be a lot of hungry people in the Family Life Center. And actually, I imagine that there would be a full parking lot at Chick-fil-A. But Jesus took the loaves and he gave thanks. And he distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted, and he did the same with the fish. You see, he wasn't stingy with it either. Everyone ate as much as they wanted. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, I want you to go gather the pieces that are left over so that nothing goes to waste. And verse 13 says, so they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over. Now, if you're not impressed by this, I don't know what to tell you. But the people that were there, this is what they had to say in verse 14. When they had saw the sign that Jesus performed, they say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Now when evening came, the disciples headed to Capernaum by boat. Now it was night, and Jesus had not yet come to them, and so they headed out. To make matters worse, a strong wind came through, which made the seas rough. And they rowed as quickly as they could. And when they had gone about 3 to 4 miles, in which I looked on a map, and that's about halfway between Tiberias and Capernaum. And so when they had made it about halfway, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, and drawing near the boat, they were afraid. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. So not only was Jesus walking on the water 4 miles offshore, they only rowed halfway to their destination. They rowed halfway to get to where they needed to go. Now we're going to skip all the way ahead to chapter 9 to find the next miracle that Jesus performs in this book. And he comes across a blind man. And his disciples asked him, who has sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus replied, neither this man or his parents have sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is the day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And when he had said these things, he spit in the ground and made clay with the saliva. And he rubbed this clay on the man's face, or on his eyes, and told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. So he went and washed, and he came back seeing. Now, I've seen videos of people who were colorblind receiving glasses that allowed them to see color for the first time. And the reactions are absolutely priceless. But can you imagine the joy that this man had, seeing nothing but darkness his entire life, to be given his sight? There's just one problem with this. In verse 14, we see that this too happened on the Sabbath. Now we can imagine the Jews were furious at this point. This man continues to work on the Sabbath. He continues to claim that he is God's son. He cannot be sent from God. He must have a demon. We finally have to skip all the way to chapter 11 to read of the last miracle that Jesus performs in the book of John prior to his crucifixion. And this one's personal. It involves the death of Jesus' friend Lazarus. And Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, but it wasn't until 4 days after his passing that he was able to get there. And by that time, Lazarus had been buried in a tomb or a cave. And so Jesus came and saw Mary and Martha, his sisters. And they went to the cave where Lazarus was buried. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And Martha said, "Lord, it has been 4 days since he died. Surely there is a stench. I don't think you want to do that." And Jesus said to her in verse 40, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" So they took the stone away from the place where the dead man was lying, and Jesus lifted his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." Now when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go." Now, of all the miracles that Jesus performed, this one was probably the most improbable. Right? Because death is permanent, at least our physical death, our physical bodies. Death is permanent. But humanly speaking, each of these problems seemed as impossible as calculus to a preschooler. But to Jesus, the solution was obvious. He understood what is impossible for people is possible for God. But the impossible doesn't stop there. No show is complete without a big finale. And I know I said we were going to stick with the book of John, but if you'll allow me for just a minute, I'd like to jump over to the book of Matthew, chapter 27. And because the book of John doesn't go into much detail of the flogging and the mocking that Jesus endured before and while on the cross, I want to look at a particular statement that was made starting in verse 49. This is while Jesus is on the cross, and he has the sign, King of the Jews, over his head. We read, "And those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, 'You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross.' Likewise, the chief priests also, mocking with the scribes and elders, said, 'He saved others. Himself he cannot save.'" Now we have a phrase in the English language called eating your own words. And I think that phrase would fit in nicely right here. Because 3 days later, just as Jesus had been preaching, the stone was rolled away. The temple was rebuilt, and Jesus conquered death, fulfilling the promise of God to all mankind, never to die again, but to ascend into heaven to be seated at the right hand of God. And we know this because he revealed himself. In John chapter 20, we see he revealed himself first to his mother, Mary, at the tomb, then to the disciples. But as we read, starting in verse 24, now Thomas, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, "We have seen the Lord." So he said to them, this is Thomas speaking, "Unless I see his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. And Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in their midst, and said, Peace to you. Then he said to Thomas, Reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it in my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, My Lord and my God. Now you remember that comment that I told you to hang on to earlier? The comment that Jesus made to the nobleman, you people just won't believe unless you see signs and wonders. Look at what Jesus says to Thomas next. It's kind of the same thing. Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Talk about a punch in the stomach. Thomas had been right there beside Jesus all this time, seeing him perform miracle after miracle. Yet, he said, unless I can put my fingers in the scars in his hands and I can put my hands in his side where the sword pierced him, I will not believe. O ye of little faith. And you know, we haven't even covered all the miracles that Jesus has performed. I'm finishing out this chapter back in verse 30. He says, And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these 7 or 8 are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And I really like the way John reiterates the same thing in the very next chapter in verse 25, when he says, And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. How could Thomas doubt? And that's why I asked the question, and I'm going to ask it again. Are you not impressed by the miracles of Jesus? I hope you are impressed. Because after all, this is the foundation of our faith. The belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. That he came to this earth born of a virgin. He performed miracles that showed the power of God and proved that he was God on earth. He was crucified and on the third day rose again, giving all who believe and are baptized into his blood the pathway to heaven. Now, if you're not impressed, I don't know what else to say. But one day, every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And that will be a great day for some and a sad day for many. If there's anyone here who is not a Christian and wants to know more about this man, Jesus, and what these miracles mean for you, we're going to have an invitation song in a minute, and we ask that you come down. There will be an elder at the front that will talk with you and work with you and study with you. Maybe there's someone here who does believe, but has not yet come into contact with the blood of Christ through baptism. The waters behind me are ready and waiting. If there's anyone here who has a need that can be met with a public response, the time is yours now as we stand and sing.